The 24-Carat Buddha and Other Fables by Maxine Harris. Publisher, the Sidran Institute Press of Baltimore, Maryland. The most evil man in town. The village where Sonia lived with her parents and many of her relatives had been a quiet and happy place until that awful day when the great mountain roared and shook and the rocks and mud slid from the hills, covering everything in their path and killing many of the villagers. When the rubble was cleared, Sonia realized her worst fears. Her parents and her home were gone. After many days of grief and prayer, the villagers who had survived the disaster met to decide what to do about the terrible devastation and how to care for the many children, like Sonia, who were now orphans. After much discussion and with great feelings of sorrow, the villagers decided that any child who had relatives living in safety, away from the site of the avalanche, should be sent to those relatives. That was how it was agreed that Sonia should go live with her uncle. As she rode on the back of the wagon that was to take her to her new home, Sonia realized that she knew very little about the man who was to become her guardian, except that he lived by the sea, had no children or a wife of his own, and was a very powerful man. Even though this uncle was her father's only brother, Sonia had seen him just once, when he had come to visit after her grandmother died. All that Sonia remembered was that he said very little, and other people seemed to grow quiet whenever he entered the room. Perhaps he was shy like her mother had been. Sonia would have to take her time to get to know him. As the long trip continued, Sonia thought about her parents. She could see her mother's bright smile and hear her father singing as he tended the garden that had supplied much of their food. Now all she had left of those happy times was a gold locket she wore around her neck and a piece of silver her father had given her on her last birthday. Sonia thought about her two treasures and began to cry. She had so little left of the life she had enjoyed. When she arrived in the village by the sea that was to be her new home, Sonia began to ask the people she met where she might find her uncle. Each time she mentioned his name, she met the same reaction. People looked down and began to quicken their steps away from her. Oh dear, she thought to herself. Perhaps something terrible has happened to my uncle, and now I will have no one at all. At last she wandered into the town church and saw the priests getting ready for the evening service. Holy Father, please help me. I am one of the orphans from the avalanche, and I have been sent here to live with my uncle. But every time I mention his name, people turn from me and hurry away. Please help me find my uncle. Of course I will help you, my child. Just tell me who your uncle is, said the priest in a calm voice. But when Sonia mentioned her uncle's name, she saw the priest's mouth fall open. You cannot possibly want to see him, exclaimed the priest. He is the most evil man in town. The priest's words hit her with the force of the mudslides that had destroyed her village. Her uncle was her only living relative. How could this possibly be true? Just tell me where he lives, she muttered in a choked voice. I have no choice but to go to him. Although he was reluctant to send a young girl to live with a man he knew to be ruthless, the priest gave Sonia the directions she requested, and with a bowed head she left the church and headed to the large house overlooking the sea and the beginning of her new life. And while her uncle did not greet her with a warm welcome when she rang the bell outside his door, he did not turn her away either. Instead, he listened to her story of loss and sadness, and he told her she could stay with him in a small room at the back of his very large house, if she kept to herself and did as he requested. Sonia was so relieved that her uncle did not turn her away or behave terribly that she accepted his conditions and went exhausted to her little room. Oh, but before she had even a minute to put her head on the pillow, her uncle was standing outside her door shouting, Who said you could sleep? He bellowed. I can see that you're a lazy one just like my brother. If you want to eat, you must work. Come out of that room and help the cook prepare dinner. Oh, Sonia's heart began to race as her uncle screamed. Her father had been a gentleman, and Sonia was not accustomed to yelling. But perhaps what scared her even more than the loud shouting was the horrible look in her uncle's eyes. There was no kindness there, only a coldness that made her shake as she hurried to the kitchen, too frightened to remember how exhausted she had been just a few minutes before. Sonia did her best to do as she was told and to stay out of her uncle's way, but he still found reasons to scream and threaten her. If you do not behave as I wish, I will have to beat you like the dog that you are, he would thunder. Eventually, the threats gave way to actual beatings and whippings. Sonia could just not understand why her uncle behaved the way he did. Perhaps she was doing something wrong. Perhaps he really was evil like the priest had said. Or perhaps she thought this was the way that powerful people got what they wanted. One day, Sonia's uncle saw her looking at the locket and the silver coin she had brought with her from her village. Where did you get those treasures? You are not only lazy, he cried. You are a thief as well. Give me those before I give you a beating you will not forget. But these are mine, Sonia insisted. I brought these with me from my home. They were gifts from my parents. How dare you defy me, her uncle shouted as he snatched the gold and silver from her hands and stuffed the small treasures into his pocket. Sonia's grief at the loss of her only connection to her old life was almost unbearable. It felt as if something deep inside her had snapped, but Sonia continued to live with her uncle. She did as she was told, suffering the occasional beatings, endured the almost daily harassments, and told herself that her time would come. One day, she would get even with her uncle, and then she would be free of his evil ways. Years passed, and Sonia grew into a young woman. As her uncle grew older and less powerful, he came to rely more and more on his competent niece to help him run his home and business. Sonia was put in charge of the house servants and could sometimes be heard all the way down in the street below the big house, screaming orders to the cook or the maid. One day when Sonia was bringing her uncle his lunch, she heard a low groan as she entered his room. Help me, he moaned. I need medicine. I need a doctor. I think I am dying. Don't just stand there, you lazy wench. Do something. Sonia looked at her uncle, but there was no kindness in her eye, only a frightening coldness. She turned and left his room, locking the door behind her. The maid came up behind Sonia and asked if there was anything she could do. Sonia glared at her. Do your job, woman, or I will give you a whipping you won't soon forget. More years passed, and Sonia continued to live in the big house overlooking the sea. After her uncle's death, Sonia became mistress of the house and became even more powerful than her uncle had been. He had taught her well how to run a business and a home, but she never married, and she almost never thought of her parents, or her village, or the life that had been destroyed by the terrible avalanche. One day a man from the old village appeared in town. I am looking for a young girl, he asked the first person he saw on the street. She would be a woman in her midlife by now. She and I lived in the same village many years ago. A huge avalanche destroyed our homes, and she came here to live with her uncle. Do you know where she might be? Her name is Sonia. As the townsperson heard the name, he cringed. You cannot possibly want to see her, he warned. She is the most evil woman in town. Most evil man in town. As we are growing up, we all promise ourselves that we will never be like the people in our lives who have caused us pain. We vow never to scream and holler the way Dad did, or never to become emotionally withdrawn the way Mom was. We will be different. We tell ourselves, and implied in that promise is the belief that we will be better. And when we make that promise, we are sincere in our intentions, but often, without our awareness, in small, almost imperceptible increments, we find ourselves saying the very words, doing the same things that we swore we would not. How to avoid replicating the sins of the past becomes a central mission in any recovery process. It may well require a special vigilance to learn from the past without repeating it, because by bringing the painful dynamics of childhood into the present, we remain the prisoner of the old abuses long after we think we have moved on.